I'd like to welcome you all again to On Giving. And On Giving is presented by Skystone Partners. It is an incisive commentary and analysis at the intersection of philanthropy and the greater good. I'm Liz Knuppel, President and CEO of Skystone Partners, where we believe philanthropy is a powerful force for good. And I'm proud to welcome you, dear guests, and our interviewee, our guest here today, Dr. Lilya Wagner. Hi there, Lilya. Would you like to pop on screen? Hello, hello. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And it's a real privilege to be here with you and talk about this exciting topic.
Excellent, excellent. And we're glad here. And this exciting topic is diversity and philanthropy. And in the context that's a little broader than maybe we've talked about here in this forum before, a little broader than race or gender. And before we dive into the topic, which is close to my heart, and I know it's close to yours too, as Lilya, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Wagner, dear attendees, and why we invited her to be our guest here today and talk to us about diversity and philanthropy. Lilya is a preeminent practitioner, author, professor, consultant, and researcher in philanthropy. And in fact, Dr. Wagner served as Director of Philanthropic Service for Institutions at the Lilly School until early 2020, having held that position for 12 years, and she continues to remain affiliated with the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. Dr. Wagner was Vice President for Philanthropy at Counterpart International in Washington, D.C., an international development organization which provides a variety of services and projects in many countries. Prior to joining Counterpart, Dr. Wagner completed 14 years of association with the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University, serving as Associate Director for Public Service and Director of the Women's Philanthropy Institute. Her responsibilities included developing and managing projects and programs such as the Philanthropic Ambassadors and the Hispanic Stewardship Development Partnership. She was in charge of curriculum preparation and revision for the fundraising school and was a frequent workshop speaker and presenter in North America and internationally. She's done training, speaking, and consulting in more than 70 countries. And what I'd like to say is more than likely each of you, because I know I have benefited directly from the curricula she has developed or the courses that she's taught. Not only is she a prolific speaker, teacher, writer, and consultant, she has won many awards, including the Henry A. Rosso Medal for Lifetime Achievement in Ethical Fundraising by the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Her books, Careers in Fundraising and Diversity in Philanthropy, Expanding the Circle of Giving, have both won the AFP Skystone Partners Prize for Research in Philanthropy in 2001 and 2016, respectively. The topic we'll be discussing today, diversity and philanthropy, reflects Dr. Wagner's own background as a refugee and immigrant, her extensive global work through the Lilly, Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, as well as other organizations that have engaged her as a consultant and a trainer, and her interest in cultural differences and how they enrich civil society. Until this year, Dr. Wagner was the only author to win the Skystone Partners Prize twice. Now, for Lilya, the conversation for this work is professional and personal. At the age of 3, she and her family fled Estonia when the KGB had targeted to kill her father. Through 4 countries and through the generosity of people along every step of the way, she and her family escaped with their lives and arrived safely in the United States. Within a year, her father was appointed to a post in South America, where the family worked and lived until Lilya was in high school. And by the time she was 10, she spoke 4 languages, had traveled through and lived in numerous countries, and their family survived because of the cross-cultural and global generosity they experienced. Now, while the work aligns with her personal story, I think it's important to remember that diversity and philanthropy is a deeply researched compilation and representation of generosity across many cultures, and is quite possibly the most comprehensive collection of research and experience-based practice in diversity and giving. And part of the reason that Lilya led this work going forward was in homage to the population groups who took her in across her early life and whose generosity she has continued to experience across the span of her life and her career. So before we begin our conversation with Dr. Wagner, I'd like to touch on just a couple of housekeeping items. First, about format. We'll have some discussion with Lilya about her research and findings, and then we'll have a few minutes for select questions from you before we wrap up the conversation. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature that's located at the bottom of your screen. The chat feature you used to say hello is at the top of the hour is currently turned off. Our question moderator and member of the Skystone Partners team, Kay Marsh Green, will receive your questions. She'll be curating a number of them, so Lilya has the opportunity to answer as many as we can without duplicates. Kay is behind the scenes now and will join us for the Q&A section. So down to business. Lilya, we're going to begin our conversation the way we begin every episode of On Giving. What does a philanthropist look like?
I think a philanthropist wears many, many faces, a multitude of faces. I think about some of the people that I have encountered when I was doing fundraising. I think about the people who showed generosity when we came to America with absolutely nothing except one suitcase for 4 of us. Of course, I was little, so I didn't need much. But I think about the people who collected items so that we could set up at least minimal housekeeping. I think about the wealthy that I have helped determine. Just recently, I had a Zoom meeting with somebody who said, I just came into a lot of money. I want to do something, but I don't know how.
Right.
And unfortunately, some of these people have heard about the scams in our profession, which of course exists in every profession. So they're more cautious. So the role of the fundraiser in helping philanthropists is huge. So the face of a philanthropist to respond to you can be about as varied as we human beings are in culture, in personality, in income level. And what's always interested me was when I was following some of the research that has been done about who is giving and to what. The major donors, as those of you who are on this session, I'm sure they have noticed that in previous decade or 2 decades, we've seen some changes in behaviors in the major donors. But if you look at the 3 levels of income in the United States, and you see the major donors, then the middle level of giving, and then the lowest level, we have found through some research studies that the lowest sometimes gives a bigger percent. They maybe because they understand, maybe they've been there, they know what a need is. But across the board, I think what really distinguishes generosity is that it is diverse. People give for so many different reasons. They give from various backgrounds. So a philanthropist, to me, simply could be defined as anybody who has seen a need and wants to fill it with his or her generosity. That's the beauty of what we do as fundraisers, is to help them accomplish that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that description because it's so inclusive and recognizes that everyone has different means, and that our means may be financial, but they may be otherwise as well. You know, it's seeing a need and responding to the need in the way that we best can fill that need. Yeah. Yeah. So to start our conversation off, and Lilya, I do want to mention, I love your background. We're gonna talk about culture, diversity, and fundraising. Do you mind telling us a little bit about your background and maybe couch it in the sense of when we think about culture, diversity, and fundraising, what are some of the cultural influences in development, in fundraising, in philanthropy? But let's talk about your background first.
Okay. Well, my background is actually a photo I took. It's the coast of Estonia. We're on the Baltic Sea and the Bay of Finland. And also we have a huge lake between us and Russia. Unfortunately, not as long as we wish it were, given the current events, which greatly disturb me since I've done quite a bit of work in Ukraine. And I hope that all of us, as a quick aside, think about the people who are trying to help there and give as generously as we can and wisely. Anyhow, thinking about cultures, let me give you one quick example that somewhat amuses me. My father was a remarkable man. He was a pastor, a teacher, an educator, and a leader. And in Estonia, people are fairly formal. Now we have a lot of Western and other influences, but as a traditional culture, I might call somebody Dr. Smith, even if we've been friends for 2 decades. Now, we go from that setting to the Latin American setting, the Hispanic or Latino. Now we get into one of these issues of terminology, which we also have to address when we think of diversity. So what happens in that, in Bolivia, for example? Well, first of all, it's not just a handshake, it's the abrazo, the quick hug, and possibly a quick sort of kiss on the, exactly.
Yeah.
So here's my dad. What just happened? You know, it was a cultural jolt.
Sure.
But as fundraisers, we need to be aware of some of these, what comes naturally to us. There's a very interesting book, Do's and Don'ts. I'm blanking on it right now, but I can give it to you later. But there's a very interesting book published about these types of things that actually I'm looking it up right now. Do's and Taboos Around the World.
Ah, very good.
And there's also another book called Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands. And those are vignettes of culture from about 50 countries. So when we think about how we implement as fundraisers these principles of diversity, even some of these behaviors have to be considered. One of the things that I have fallen into it in my work in over 80 countries is a matter of gift giving. And there's a very interesting illustration in the Do's and Taboos book where it says, don't admire a gift too well because you might have to go home with it. And it shows an Arab holding a camel. And then another thing that we have to consider is the use of language. Now, so much of the world uses one way or another English. It's become almost a universal language. But how we talk, I remember one time when I was doing training in Southern Australia, and one of my colleagues who was with me, we were at a university, and the university had a gorgeous campus, and it was a small river running through it. So at the end of the discussion, she looked at the group and said, well, whatever floats your boat. Now, as an American, we understand, but it was the funniest thing, and I had to really control myself because I saw the people looking at each other and mouthing the words, float your boat, what the... And then the funniest happened is that they looked out the window like this to see if there was a boat down there in the river. So because English was my third language, I still remain quite conscious of some of the things that we say. And one of the illustrations in that book that sticks in my mind, the Do's and Taboos, is a waiter coming in to tell the cook. The American says, scratch the potatoes. So you can imagine what the little balloon shows, a little rake, and this having to scratch each potato. So these are some of the cultural factors. And I think later on, probably we'll talk a little bit more about some of how do we get culturally proficient, but being observant. And I didn't think about it when I got dressed this morning, but I put on Estonian jewelry. When we notice something unique like that, that could be a wonderful opener, because this is actually a pendant made out of the old coins, pre-Soviet coins that somebody made for me with a cutout. And this one celebrates our years of freedom. I hadn't thought about it. It was natural for me in thinking on diversity. I put something on that was the most meaningful for me.
Yeah.
So when we think about these cultural matters, to me, they're so enriching. They're not scary. They're not something that adds to the burden of the fundraiser. I know how busy fundraisers are. I've had several jobs. One of my first jobs was to raise a lot of money to save a higher education institution. And I know how busy we are, but if we make this something as a matter of interest that translates into our professional records and interaction, then it isn't just one more thing we have to do.
You know, that's an excellent point, Lilya. And I think what you've said is it's really about being human with one another. It's noticing, because I have to say, we're on Zoom and I can't see your jewelry very well, but it was striking. And we were having such a good time in our conversation before the interview that I didn't have a chance to remark on that. And wow, what a wonderful connection point. So what you're saying is, when we're thinking about cultural differences and diversity, cultural competency, when we are fundraisers, what you're saying is breathe, allow yourself to be human, allow yourself to be curious, and you just might learn something. And you might find a wonderful connection point with someone else. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Yes, and our communities, without a doubt, are becoming more and more diverse. I know when I was living in Indianapolis, it was very interesting over those, well, I was sort of in and out a lot, but to observe how many new cultures came in and how they were either embraced or they were kept at an arm's length, because sometimes differences do threaten us. Here in the Washington, D.C. area, for some reason this year, maybe it's because I'm not traveling as much anymore or traveling at all because of COVID, but I've noticed how many flocks of birds we have, whether they're Canada geese or whether they're starlings. They seem to congregate in flocks. And this whole old saying of birds of a feather flock together. We do, as humans, have a tendency to be comfortable with those who are more like us. But I think we lose out a lot if we don't expand that with whether it's certain commonalities because of certain interests. Like some population groups have far more interest in supporting education than others because of tradition or some built-in values in their culture. But we can build on those similarities and appreciate the differences as a learning experience, not as a threat.
Sure.
I know that I had taken some of my relatives when they came to visit. I had taken them to, a resort town nearby. And they wanted to play in the water because they had never been to the ocean. You know, Estonia is surrounded almost by water, but not the ocean. So, and I didn't feel like getting wet. It was commonplace for me. So I walked on the boardwalk and I saw a t-shirt, a red t-shirt with big white letters on it. And it said, "You're an American now, speak English."
Ooh.
We also know through research that people who speak more than one language have developed some parts of the brain better. So we should appreciate those other languages and also realize just how much of an effort. I watched my mother try to learn English over those years. For us kids, it was just one more language. It didn't matter. But for my mother, how difficult it was. And yet she really tried to communicate in the right way and speak the right English. So keeping some of those things in mind as we look at diverse populations who could be our donors, who might want to be our donors because of a sense of belonging.
Right.
And I know I'm deeply grateful for Hispanic groups in the bad part of Brooklyn, New York, who gave us a context when we didn't have a context. I mean, how many Estonians do you know?
I actually, including you, 5, including you, 5.
Okay.
But with that in mind, I think what you're talking about, Lilya, is when we think about our donors and philanthropy, we need to, you hear different things about emotional intelligence and what have different kinds of intelligence. I think what you're talking about here is as our culture becomes more rich, more diverse, more just more diverse, we're talking about cultural intelligence here. And, we've talked about facts and cultural traits, knowledge about cultures, and really awareness of your own culture. But how do we really develop that cultural intelligence that can help us connect with our donors? And I don't mean in just a blocking and tackling kind of a way, but rather in a really authentic kind of a way. How do we develop that in ourselves?
Well, one of the things that as I started doing workshops on this topic way back in the early 90s and started developing also some of my own knowledge, and I became more aware of the theories on how we move from a first impression to a deeper knowledge to action.
Mm.
And I think some of this is very relevant to us as fundraisers. For example, we first of all need to acquire some knowledge about the cultures, facts, some traits, then awareness of ourselves and others. What are these traits that maybe we share, traits that we can build on, especially as we look at donor research, prospect research.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, we develop some specific actions, shall we say, that develop the cultural intelligence in us.
Mm-hmm.
But it starts with awareness. It starts with wanting to be interested in the other party. Very little research needed to understand. I mean, this book that I just mentioned, Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands, it has some of those. That would be a perfect example. Also, in our communities, as people do flock together, there are times when we can go to some of the events, participate, get to know the neighbors. And there's another researcher who wrote about there are 4 major sectors in developing cultural competence. The first is personal. Understand yourself. Why do you do what you do? So that you're alert to some of these factors in others. And then there's a cognitive. Build your knowledge. This doesn't have to be like a master's thesis or a doctoral program. It's awareness and maybe learning in little bits, interesting bits. Then there's the interpersonal. I know when I took one of my recent jobs here in the DC area, and I heard somebody say, "Oh, I finally got to know my neighbors. They're not so bad." And I thought, my goodness, what are you talking about? I loved it. I had Thai neighbors and Japanese neighbors and a family from Peru, all in my neighborhood. And to me, it's very enriching. And then, of course, you take all these 3 steps, the personal, the cognitive, the interpersonal, you put these together into a professional package that is good and right for you. Mm-hmm. But an openness to learning, to finding out what are these differences and how do they translate into that generosity that we want to attract.
Right. And therefore, acceptance, appreciation, and it really helps us do what we as fundraisers are designed to do and are intended to do, which is build that conduit between the donor and the causes that they want to support, the vision that they want to see realized on the planet, and can help do through their contributions. So through that cultural intelligence. So when we're talking about this topic, we've also talked, you mentioned birds of a feather flock together, and people who, find themselves often in homogenous groups, and it's easy to stay there because that's your tribe, those are your people, or your birds, as the case may be. But we've also talked a little bit about the value of generations. When I'm a starling over here looking at the Canada goose over there, what generalizations, as I'm learning about the Canada goose, because I want to meet them, but I don't know very much about them, what's the value and what are the dangers of these generalizations when you're learning kind of broadly in that first step beyond the personal, knowing who I am, I'm a starling, and learning who they are, they're Canada geese. What are the dangers and the values of those generalizations?
I think, first of all, we should address two things about generalizations. Generalizations are different from stereotypes. Stereotypes might be based, and they're not all, we tend to think that stereotypes are all negative, but stereotypes are those perceptions that we have about others that may or may not be negative or positive, or may not be accurate. Generalizations are different because they take a sample of a population group and see what are the most predominant traits of those groups. Now, one thing that I was told when I did a lot of work in countries of Southeast Asia is how very important celebrations are. In fact, our Thai neighbors said, I think it was yesterday or the day before, they had a major Thai holiday. Now, this is important to them, even though they are here in America, they work here, they're very much acculturated, but that kind of thing is very important to them. Whereas I have some friends or relatives, New Year's, oh yeah, let's have a party. Nah, we'll just clean the house then. It's not as important. So many of these generalizations that we find in the population groups are perhaps common to human beings, but they are more predominant for that particular group. And some of these, if I may, I'd like to point out what some of these generalizations could be. What we could say is this is kind of a litmus test for a group. That doesn't mean that everybody is like that. I suspect that quite a few of the listeners today have done the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is probably that or the DISC. We used to have a course in the fundraising school that emphasized that because we learned how to determine certain traits in our donors, but not ask from our perspective, but from the donor's perspective. The same thing translates into making generalizations. Like I'm a strong ENTJ, but if you compare me to another ENTJ, we'll probably have some differences. The same thing with, we look at the cultural aspects. The countries that speak Spanish, for example, I've done kind of work in countries as diverse as, let me think, Argentina, where I used to go quite a bit, versus Puerto Rico. There are certain differences in language that we have to be careful about. So we need to look at generalizations as our guideposts that we're going to delve into more later. So some of the things that I see that provide a basis for generalizations are, first of all, what's the concept of reciprocity, of giving back? Does one culture have more of a tendency to take, another has more of a tendency to give back? This is not a value judgment. This is a trait. Another thing that we need to remember is that religion plays a very major role in all cultures and their generosity. And we have seen that. There are some beautiful mandates, for example, in Islam. There are some other religions that say you should. There are some religions that say you must be generous. So understanding their basis for this obligation or lack of obligation to give is also important. Another thing that is very significant is that we as fundraisers need to understand what strategies work best for various population groups. Does social media work better for some than others? I can tell you right now, Estonians tend to be fiercely independent and in some ways introverted. My personality was shaped a lot by living with Hispanics as I grew up. So what are some of who is better for a face-to-face visit versus an email, versus a hard copy letter, versus an event, versus a meeting? Some of these are actually very serious considerations. Leadership is definitely important, because there are some cultures that are much more keen on seeing, okay, what did the leader do? And some of that goes back to their culture in terms of what has happened politically. When I did a lot of work in a number of African countries, some of what was occurring had definite roots, whether positive or negative. That wasn't my judgment to make, but definite roots in the colonization eras and influences. So those are some of the things as we talk about the cognitive aspect of this diversity knowledge that enter into that. Then there is the factor of silent generosity. I've worked with groups in various countries that really don't want others to know that they are generous. There's some good reasons, there are some traditional reasons for this, but they may be generous. How do we tap into that kind of an inclination?
Oh, Dr. Wagner, I think Minnesotans are part of that silent generosity, having spent some time in Minnesota. Pardon me. I hear that. It's speaking the language. I hear it. Absolutely. Pardon me for interrupting.
No,
Yeah.
that's okay.
Yeah. I love that.
Then there's another matter of volunteering. Now, this also delves into the language aspect. I was fortunate to be sent very soon after the Soviet Union broke up into many of those former countries, including my own. Well, if you know much about what the life was like in the Soviet Union, volunteering was compulsory. Okay, you're going to go plant trees over there this weekend. If you don't, uh-oh. And it was serious. So we actually had to think about, and also prospect research. When you think about the files that the KGB kept on just my father, never mind all the files that were kept. And of course, many population groups had a lot of fun digging through these files when freedom came and putting them in the mud and trampling over them. I'm speaking from experience with my relatives. Another thing that we can be very much aware of is planned versus unplanned gifts. And this isn't just planned giving. One thing that when I've researched into that, we found that various population groups are much more shy about planned giving. But if we let them understand, help them understand what are the benefits to us, like my husband and I have a living trust because we took in kids that we did not formally adopt. So it's important for them to be part of our heritage. And so that's where perhaps more fundraising education is necessary. Another factor is that in many population groups, there is almost a sequence where family comes first, distant relatives. So when I was helping with some of the refugee work post the Vietnam War and the Cambodian Holocaust, it was very interesting to me to see how families were created and claimed. When we were trying to help some of them get out of the camps and go to another country, who was part of the family? And it wasn't just opportunism, it was real. And so we need to understand this matter of family. The value of education, I think, is becoming more and more universal. I was in one country where there was quite a difference in class structures. And I had made friends with a cab driver. Cab drivers are sometimes my best friends in countries that I go to work at. And he was a marvelous artist. And I said, aren't you going to do something with that? And he said, I can't. I'm stuck. I can't go any further. So understanding some of the history of why education is more important for some groups than others. He said, the thing that'll build up my country is education, but we're not there yet. And I really felt sad about that.
Yeah.
Then some other factors are the matter of community. Who is your community? Is it your immediate community? Is it your community of interest? Is it your community because you go to church across the city versus your neighboring church? What loyalties do you have to the broader group that you feel you belong to?
Sure. And so when we're talking about pardon me, I'm sorry, pardon me, I interrupted.
It's okay, I don't mind you.
No, I'm just thinking about all of these, and I'm scribbling notes away because I've learned so much in these few minutes, just how we think about generalizations and how we look to others when we're thinking about philanthropy. And so when we are creating a basis through these generalizations to try to see through the other person's eyes, how do we sort of flip the switch so that we're not building ourselves into a box, but rather we're reaching outside of our own box, we see all of these differences, and how do we take, I'm imagining all these differences are sticks. How do we take all of the sticks and line them all up so we build a bridge rather than, throw them on the ground and let them rot or take fire or something like that?
I do want to answer that, but I want to address like 4 more factors.
Oh, pardon me. I'm sorry, Dr.
That's okay.
No.
But you bring up a very good point, and I do want to get to that very quickly. One thing that we also need to remember is tax considerations. For us, giving in the United States, and I just finished doing our taxes with a son-in-law, so I'm very conscious of that. But in some countries, this doesn't exist. It's giving because of taxes is not important, and this translates to North American habits. Another one is a matter of recognition. In some cultures, the recognition is super important. For some, for example, for me, I love it. We all like recognition, but I want to know much more seriously, what did my money do? So you can see that there's this difference in possible attitudes. Another thing that I have noticed over many years, especially when I lived in Brooklyn as a teenager, was a distrust of mainstream organizations. And some of that still persists. And we need to know, is our organization accepted, understood, valued before we go to any kind of group of donors, regardless of who they are? The role of government, I've already hinted at that with my example of post-Soviet. But again, what is the government doing? I had a very interesting experience when the Ford Foundation sent me to do some training in China, and we had people from all over the country. And some of the perceptions of, oh, our government is accepting the nonprofits. What does it really mean now? So that was very interesting to research and understand so I could do the correct training. And then, of course, there are the legal issues. I know that in one country where we were talking about getting donations from businesses, from corporations, that one of the people said, well, it's accepted here that whatever when we get a donation, we're going to slip some of it back under the table to the donor. It's accepted. How do we get around that? Because if we look at the International Code of Ethics for AFP, for example, we can't do that. So some of those we need to understand. And I want to stress, it's not a matter of value statements, it's differences. Now, some of these differences we can consider as negatives, but we can address them that way. I'd like to go to the excellent question you brought up. Excuse me. Anything you want to add to what I just finished with?
Well,
before I go to that?
I don't know that I could. I actually have. Well, what it seems to me is there are so many factors, and that's kind of what brings me to the question, because I was beginning to feel like, oh, and Lilya, you and I have talked about this. I've lived in Hungary, I've lived in Germany, I've done business in China, been all over the world, and had, until my Asian experiences, considered myself pretty culturally competent. I discovered I was culturally competent in Western Europe or in Eastern Europe, but not in Asia, so to speak. But so there's all of these considerations, all of these things that we need to be thinking about, because I was, executive director for an organization that was doing a ton of work in China. How do we line all of these up and be able to build that bridge? Because you're referring to some things that I experienced that weren't the same, but similar. And in a younger iteration of myself, was absolutely aggrieved that this was how philanthropy looked to this culture, and wanted to be honoring of that culture, understanding full well that they were trying to give gifts to a United States registered 501c3, and we needed to be mindful of our laws here in the United States. And so just those things, how do we reach out, how do we turn this into a bridge instead of a barrier, all of these differences? And wow.
A couple of comments. There was a Harvard Business Review, I used to read that regularly, article that talked about the need for code switching. When we saw businesses really expand into other countries, we also observed that many of the people who worked for those businesses did not really know how to manage themselves or the business in another country. So Harvard Business Review, I noted, started having all kinds of articles on how do you do this? And so it isn't just the realm of philanthropy and fundraising. This was a very serious matter. Now, I haven't tracked it for a couple of years, but for a long time, it was a very serious matter. If we send people over there, are they going to hurt or help our business?
Right.
And so this matter of code switching was defined as the ability to modify behavior to accommodate various cultural norms, to have a capacity to manage the psychological challenges that arise when cultural knowledge is translated into action. I think that's a very serious definition for us as fundraisers. And if you want to encapsulate, which is almost impossible. The other thing that I wanted to say as I lead into what your comment and your question are, since I wrote the book, I have been really glad to see research increasing. You interviewed a dear friend of mine, Dr. Tyrone Freeman, who has focused on African-American philanthropy. I know some Asian Americans who have delved into more serious research on this. So the work is growing, and I'd like to encourage your listeners and anybody to engage in some way of doing this research. When I used to teach a course in this at St. Mary's in Minnesota, in this, I used to have as a final assignment for people, my students, to take a particular culture and actually go find people from that culture and write a paper on how they would relate in terms of fundraising. Well, one of the interesting things was that one of my young students, he was from a Czech background, Czechoslovakia background. And as he started delving more into, hey, what are my roots? Why do we do this at Christmas? Why is this particular day important? Why do we say this, even if translated in English? And he actually thanked me for that assignment because he felt that it enriched his own background. So I think that's one of the things that is elemental for code switching.
Lilya, if I may ask a question. So if I've noticed around the country, because we travel around the country, if I've noticed that women wear their makeup differently in different regions and I apply my makeup that way when I go to the different regions, is that code switching?
I think so.
Okay. Okay. Just notice a little bit. Some women, some regions they wear a lot of liquid eyeliner. Other regions they wear the crayon eyeliner. Just paying attention. Is that a little bit of that?
Even dress.
Okay, pardon me, but I was just checking in.
That's fine. I have a list here that I've used in presentations, becoming culturally proficient, and we can use this as a takeoff point. One of these is avoid obvious or unnecessary assumptions. Like one time when I was still teaching full-time for the School of Philanthropy, there was a gentleman by the name of Martinez in my class. And because Spanish was my fourth language and I am very fluent and I don't think about it. So I walked up to him and said something in Spanish. It was natural for me. And he laughed and he said, I don't speak Spanish. I had made an assumption.
Sure.
And so I've been a little bit more careful. I'm also very interested in where people are from, especially in an area like DC, because we have so many varied populations. So I might actually, I used to say, where are you from? But that would offend people because they might think, okay, I don't fit, I don't belong.
You're othering them, so to speak.
Yeah, I say, By the way, I'm from Estonia. Where are you from? Because I like your accent, and I frequently do. It's genuine. So anyway, obvious assumptions. And then we also need to be very aware of verbal and nonverbal communication. Who talks with their hands,
Right.
illustrating everything, and who is very staid about it. And that gives us some clues as to what might be the next step. How do we communicate with them?
Right.
Time differences. I remember many years ago when I was participating in training for UNICEF in Paris. That was one of my real hardship gigs. And we had people from 20 different countries, about 40 people. And boy, did the time difference come about. And again, it's not a value system. It is what works for that group. The time differences. Then food, of course, food can be a real challenge when you're trying to get acquainted with another culture. I'm not particularly fond of seafood. And I know when I was in one country, they ordered for me and I had this whole platter of everything from octopus to shrimp. And I wasn't sure what I would do, but that's a whole different story. So another thing that we need to be aware of is the form of address. Do you call me Lilya? Do you call me Dr. Wagner? Do you call me Mrs. Wagner? What is comfortable for that particular culture? Like I already mentioned quite a while ago, in Estonia, people tended to keep talking about Mrs., Mr., Ms., whatever, although that's loosened up a lot since the Western influences came in a lot. And of course, some sensitivity. In America, I'm always proud of groups that I've worked with, so many different cultural groups, and how they really want to belong. They want to assimilate. But without a doubt, their traditions, their roots are so important. And that's where just a little bit of research comes in. So I think if I were to summarize, what would a fundraiser do? First of all, is to be aware of the differences. Secondly, to look at some of the most common generalities that we can think about. I just mentioned a form of address. I remember one interesting thing when I was doing some training in Azerbaijan, and I have never colored my hair, just didn't want to. But even some of the women that lived on the street colored their hair. And it was very much a cultural thing for them. So when you translate some of that behavior, when they come to America and really want to belong, we also need to recognize what are some of those traditions they cherish? What are some of the importances in my culture that if you're going to ask me to participate in your organization, what's important for me? And of course, that could be a great way to build some bridges.
Right. Right.
So I think we go back to those 4 steps that I mentioned. And one is personal. What do I know about them? When I was doing training in so many different countries, I would actually stay up late at night and of course, the internet helped a great deal once all that information started coming. Remember, I've been at this a long time. But I would really to make an effort to learn about the country so that I wouldn't have missteps. And then secondly, that leads into the cognitive aspect, from the personal to the brain.
Got it.
And then, of course, to the interpersonal. Get to know some of the people. It's a compliment to them and it's an enrichment for you. And then finally put it into your professional practice. Now, one fear that I have when we talk about this is that fundraisers are going to say, oh, yikes, one more thing to do, one more thing to think about. It should just add to our package of what we look at and do with our donors. It's just a little bit of a further step for some of them. And I know when I was working with the Women's Philanthropy Institute, there were some people that were actually saying, and this was some years ago, do we even need that? Do we need this? And the more we researched it, we realized certain things that if you were talking to a couple, fundraisers would almost 80% of the time look at the man, maybe address a little bit to the woman, then back to the man. We needed that awareness and using that kind of as a fundamental example, when we realize that women's giving does have some differences, women's giving should be respected, that we just adapt those same behaviors and principles as fundraisers to different cultures.
I like that analogy. I think that's just perfect. And it helps it feel like it's not one more thing. It's just looking at one more attribute of people. And so this has been just riveting. I fast and furiously was taking notes while you were talking and noting the different books that you mentioned. I'd like to make sure before we wrap up today that our visitors, our guests on our webcast, have an opportunity to ask you some questions, because just knowing you personally, having had dinner together and chatting on Zoom, I know how much knowledge and wisdom you possess. And Kay, I am curious. I think maybe there was a question that was asked before Lilya summed up her comments about how one would begin in a fundraising division. But what other questions might we have from our friends in our audience for Lilya about diversity and generosity?
Thank you, Liz. Dr. Wagner, I thought it was fascinating. I also was writing notes as fast as I could. And it seemed like every time I had a question, you immediately answered it.
Me too. Me too.
I loved that. But I think for most development departments, the question is, how do you start? How do you start? You have your what can you do in first steps to get going and make this part of then your process?
And let me mention, I'm going to disappear for a split second.
Okay. I love that coastline of Estonia, don't you? Isn't that gorgeous?
Uh-huh.
Aha.
I want to go.
Okay.
Oh, I have that book in my bookshelf.
This is, I think, the 5th edition.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to get started, a colleague and I wrote a chapter in here just as an introduction to the topic.
Mm-hmm.
This is the 5th. Sorry, it doesn't show up well when I have the background there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's Achieving Excellence in Fundraising. It's a Wiley publication. I know you can find it on Amazon quickly. I would first of all internalize, without too much effort, a chapter like that. What are the high points of what I should look for? The second thing that I have actually done, Kay, is set up a representative small advisory group, because that's the kind of group that I can ask honestly. I can ask questions. Okay, if I wear this, or if I say this, or if I do this, or if I use this in Spanish, because I've done a lot of training in Spanish, tell me honestly, coach me. And that helps us then go to the third step, which is perhaps going into the prospect research. What are we looking for? What is our particular group? I know that when I was still in Indianapolis, we had a large influx of Somalis. That was when some of the crises in Somalia came. And one organization that I knew, I was with higher ed, and so my focus was more on the students that came from there. But one did that kind of thing, set up a representative group, and it was kind of like a bridge, both for knowledge as well as entry into that population. So those are probably the first 3 steps, because I think after that, our professional knowledge and practices are going to take over. It's just going to be part of what we do. Mm-hmm. When I was at the higher ed institution in Nebraska, in Lincoln, we had students from 14 different countries, which for central Nebraska was pretty big. And I know that I had to, even with my knowledge back then, I had to delve into some of their cultural habits and everything. And one thing that we did was we had an international festival every year. People had a chance to display their clothing. They would make their food. It was like a fair. And then we would, after the fair, we'd have a program. I still remember the pole dance that the Filipino kids did, and I held my breath hoping they wouldn't trip over those sticks. But those are the kind of things that make it real for us, that make us appreciate those differences.
Mhm.
And some of it, of course, has to do with how your particular community or your part of the country has accepted differences. I suppose that's a very individualized layer that you do have to add because attitudes do differ.
Mhm.
I've certainly noticed that when I trained all over the country.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Are there, Kay, I think our guests have experienced much of what you and I have. Every time a question would occur, Dr. Wagner would sort of intuitively answer. And I think that comes from years of consulting and coaching and researching and teaching at the Lilly School. You taught high school English for a while, I think. Is that right? Just sort of a natural educator. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you. And we are really winding up with our time today. Are there any other questions that we can pose to Dr. Wagner? I have gained
think
so
we're
much.
good.
I have gained so much today, and I can't thank you enough, because as a person who has historically considered herself pretty culturally aware, world traveler, speak number of languages, I learned so much today, and we're going to capture the books that you mentioned: Excellence in Fundraising, Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands, and the Do's and Don'ts book, as well as Diversity and Philanthropy, your book. We'll capture all of those and make sure that everyone who attended today has access to the resources that you mentioned. And there's, as one little closing piece, Lilya.
Liz, if I can interrupt you,
Yeah.
I don't mind if people email me
Okay.
because I really would like to encourage people to delve further. One thing that I did not mention that is relevant is the generational aspect.
Yes.
The more recent arrivals versus those who cherish their roots. One time when I was speaking at one of the international AFP conferences, and I usually had panels representing, in fact, Tyrone was one of those many years ago. But one of my opening statements was, out of the 6 of us, I was a moderator and I had 5 panelists. Which one is a naturalized citizen? Well, nobody guessed me. But I'm very, Liz, as you know, I'm very tied to my roots, especially once I was able to go back and recapture them in 1992. And so the more we understand, so if listeners wish to email me, ask me for any, I'm happy to send materials or even suggestions. So my email is very simple, as long as you spell my name the American way. Used to be Lilja, but at my naturalization, they changed the J to a Y, which again is another whole nother topic, names and how important they are to us. But it's just Lilya Wagner at outlook.com. But if you do email me, be sure you reference this session because I do get around quite a bit.
Indeed.
Thank you, Liz. I wanted to add that because I'm very interested in helping people take this further and further and further, like Tyrone did.
Very good. Absolutely. And Sam has posted it in the chat, and we'll include that in the follow-up email with the recording of the session as well, so that people have access. So I am so grateful to you for your experiences, for sharing what these opportunities have meant to you, and really how they have translated into global generosity over a number of decades of your hard work in research as a professor, as a consultant. And so I think what I heard from you today is that there are so many opportunities to enrich our experiences and lives, at the same time benefiting the causes that we love and serve, if we embrace diversity in its truest meaning as expressed via generosity. I thank you for your work and your insights and your time, and quite frankly, your generosity of your time today.
Thank you.
Guests
It was my pleasure. I really appreciate being invited, and it was an honor.
Absolutely.
Thank
This
you.
was delightful. It was really, really good. And as another thank you, we'll be sending a gift in your honor to the Lilly School of Philanthropy for thanking you to come here today. Guests on our webinar, thank you for the generosity of your time and attention and for your insightful questions. I hope this session will help you broaden your thoughts about culture, inclusivity, and diversity in your philanthropy programs. It's been really great. Looking forward to next time. I'd like to invite you to join us for our next On Giving, which will be a total departure from this one, but still kind of interesting. Tuesday, May 11th at 12 p.m. Eastern. Keep a lookout for the invitation. I hope that you will come. In fact, we'll be talking next time about, love this, Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and decentralized finance with cryptocurrency expert Jesse Markowitz. And our session will be called Real Donations in Virtual Currencies, Bitcoin and Beyond. So how this, actually it's diversity in currency too, isn't it, Lilya?
Yes.
Indeed.
Right.
So how we can help.
I'm going to join that one.
Oh, okay, excellent. Well, we'll make sure you're on the list. It's going to be really interesting. And I'm very excited about learning what Jesse's got to say to us about that as well. So if you'd like to learn more about Lilya's work, of course, she's made her email address available, and we'll send out the resources that she mentioned in our conversation today. And there's one last little surprise I'd like to do as we sign off. Can you give us just a little bit of closing thoughts about diversity? Because when I saw this in the materials you sent to me, you probably know that Charles, not only was he a friend, colleague, mentor to me and to you, to see him here in some of your materials. Dr. Wagner, can you read us out on promoting diversity?
Charles and I worked together, but even before that, we were close friends, and I still miss him. And when I asked him to, because I always involved other people, as you know, Liz, if you look at my book, I have lots of sidebars for every chapter, for every population group, because I think it's good to get those perspectives. And Charles sent me this, which was totally a surprise, and I love it.
I love it too.
Diversity. D, do by others as you want others to do by you. Of course, being a preacher's kid, that resonated with me right away. I invest time and energy in seeking to understand difference. And that's really what we've been focusing on. Visit and interact on meaningful levels with those who represent difference. Engage friends in events and programs celebrating diversity. Read books and periodicals that represent diverse populations. See and acknowledge difference. Internalize lessons learned, teach, and ultimately you. And there are a number of interesting resources that I can share, especially since I've taught them not just sessions, but also graduate courses. And as a closing thing, I encourage everybody to watch an old movie called The Gods Must Be Crazy. You'll get a kick out of that.
I know that one.
It's a great movie.
It's a good
anyway.
one.
Thank you again, and feel free to write to me if I can be of any help, and I hope you all take this further. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Lilya. So grateful for your time. Thank you. We'll see you all soon.